In case you want the slides, you can zap this QR code and download my slides. This will also be shown at the end of the talk. There's a bit.ly link. You can grab these things. Rather than taking time taking a photo of each slide, you can get them in full fidelity on your machine. So I'll sort of pause there for a second in case anyone wants to grab those. OK, so today we're going to talk about feedback. In the process of collecting feedback and understanding feedback from your users, from developers who interact with your product if you're building a developer-focused product, and how to use that feedback to improve the thing that you're building. A lot of this is about listening and collecting information in a way that is meaningful and delivering feedback in a way that's meaningful. A lot of it is about taking feedback and understanding feedback and channeling that into something that's beneficial for the product and the project that you're working on. This is something that's valid sort of anywhere in the product building process that you are. So if you're a startup and you've written 0 lines of code, feedback is valuable. You should be doing research. You should be collecting information about who you think your customers are. If you already have a product, if you're on a team that's built something already, collecting feedback along the journey is important as well. You want to know when things are broken or what things your customers say they want, and maybe filtering that through what you can actually deliver or what the reality is that they actually should be requesting from your product. There's a lot of things at play here, right? For mature teams, there's user experience design, there's product management, there's legal requirements, there are engineering requirements, there's technical debt, there's all these things that get built up. It's a pretty complicated system, and it's easy to get to a point where collecting feedback becomes something that's just kind of noise and just kind of frustrating to hear. It's something that can get lost in the mess, right? Your team can hear feedback and just see that as negativity, as, hey, my product isn't working, or someone, it's not good enough for you, right? Those sorts of things that get really frustrating. This slide here is kind of a tongue-in-cheek joke. Once upon a time, I studied mechanical engineering, and if you built a company that was complex like this, and you tried to make a machine out of this stack of gears, it would be over-constrained, right? You could not turn those gears and make a machine that did anything. The goal here with collecting feedback is not to over-constrain your team, but instead to gather information that can help your team to build something better and hopefully simplify and help you prioritize the things that you're building. So, going to kind of tell a little story about how we use friction logging at Stripe to improve our products. We'll kind of walk through some frameworks that we use for friction logging, the purpose of friction logging, who's involved, right? The process of delivering friction logs and receiving them, and how we gather them. And along the way, hopefully give some tips on how you might adopt this for your company that you're working at, or how maybe you can rethink the process of collecting and automating and delivering on feedback. So, like I mentioned before, I work on the developer advocacy team at Stripe. There's about a dozen of us, 10 or 12, around the world. Our job is to sort of be the go-between between the Stripe engineering and product building teams and the developers using Stripe's products. So what this means is we build things with Stripe's APIs often before anyone else does. We are sort of the 0th customer of many of the things that Stripe does. And because of that, we are sort of more like the end user developer than we are like the engineering teams at Stripe that go and build products. The concrete way of saying that is, more often than not, I'm going to stripe.com's public documentation to look at how to implement something, rather than going and diving into our wikis and Confluence pages and GitHub repositories to see how things are built on the backside. If you're unfamiliar with Stripe, there are quite a few products that go into what we build. We build payments infrastructure for the internet. Stripe has a banking-as-a-service set of products. And from the overview of sort of all of Stripe's products, this is what everything looks like. There's quite a few things there. But for banking-as-a-service, it's sort of constrained to these products here. And without going into it in too much detail, the real secret is that these are the things you could use to build a financial platform of any sort, right? These are the things that we have delivered to the world so that you can build solutions to solve your products, or just to solve your problems. But really, what happens is that these products are actually made out of everything here. So all of the things that we deliver to Stripe end users really have an impact on banking as a service. And because of that, it's a fairly complicated stack of things to deal with. When there's a bug, when there's an issue, when someone has a feature request, it doesn't just impact these couple of things in the middle, it affects everything here. So just a quick breakdown of a couple of things that our banking as a service platform include. We have Stripe Treasury. This is how you would create financial accounts. This is what you would use to create the sort of ledgers of money coming in and out of accounts. Stripe issuing is what it sounds like. You can issue debit cards virtually or physically, send them out to end users, and, for example, have accounts to draw money from for an individual. Stripe Connect is an underlying architectural set of APIs that lets you build a platform on top of Stripe's APIs. So a little convoluted, that's kind of a confusing description, but if you're building a platform or a marketplace, you use Connect so that your company has a Stripe account, other people plug their Stripe accounts in on top of yours and get the features that you've built from it. What I'm saying is that this is a fairly complicated thing, right? This is the diagram of the documentation that you see when you go to Banking as a Service from Stripe. There is a lot of stuff here. There's a lot of expertise that's gone into building this thing, and the words in the diagram are not super important. I don't want to go into like the detail of what's here, but it's a fairly complicated thing. It takes a mature engineering team. It takes a group of people who understand that they're undertaking a fairly large load of work that involves probably legal consultations, understanding of financial regulations and constraints, as well as all of the engineering things you need to build a functioning product. So once again, this is kind of the basic architecture of a Banking as a Service app, and the goal of my team earlier this year was to go through this Banking as a Service app architecture and implement it from scratch, right? So my task was to approach this from the perspective of a brand new user who had never done this before, go build an entire Banking as a Service platform, and deliver feedback to the team based on my experience there. This was in preparation for a fairly large launch. We were going through a revision of documentation and APIs and functionalities that went into this. So there's a lot of things here, right? That's quite a few things to undertake. And actually, for additional context, this was my second or third week at Stripe. So I was about as fresh to this as you could be, right? I had not interacted with these Banking as a Service APIs. My snow blindness factor was almost nothing. I had not seen this stuff before. I wasn't familiar with it, so all the problems I was encountering were brand new to me. That's actually pretty valuable when delivering feedback, because when I'm sure if you've built an engineering product or if you've used something for long enough, you get really familiar with all the little workarounds and things you can do to deal with problems you might encounter, or the little idiosyncrasies of the projects that you use and the things that you build become so familiar that you don't remember you're doing that anymore. So this friction logging process happens, like I said, at anywhere you are in building a product. Doesn't matter if you've not written code before or if you've delivered something to users for years. The entire process of collecting feedback happens within this cycle. You've probably seen something like this before. This is the product development life cycle. You may have seen it with different words or slightly different steps along the way, but generally speaking, if you're building a product, you have this envisioning phase where you collect requirements, you stack rank the things that you're going to build, you go into the building phase and you start to develop new features and send them out into the world for people to consume. The stabilize phase or the testing phase is when you actually test it before it goes out into the public. So you may have end users who are beta testers, you may have internal testers, you might have automated testing, all of those things. Then there's the deployment phase where your code goes out into public access and people can access it as real end users. And then this sort of monitor phase is where you should be collecting telemetry and analytics on what's going on. So are things breaking? Are people accessing the pages you expect them to see? Are you getting contacted on specific pages more than others? Are people having problems? Is it going great? Right? All of those things are important in the monitoring phase. For this sort of friction logging process, I'm talking about that monitoring phase and sort of it going back into the next version of envisioning and planning. The goal here is, while things are being used, to collect feedback from the people using it, whether it's developer users in our case, or it might just be a consumer user or a business user, depending on the product you're building. Listen to them, watch what they're doing, in some cases emulate what they're doing, and deliver feedback on that so you can stack rank what's coming next. So that's exactly what my team does. This is a screenshot of my colleague CJ. Just before I joined on Stripe and went through friction logging myself, he went and built a demo app using our Banking as a Service platform. And he went from scratch, again, implemented all the APIs, and documented everything that happened to him along the way. All of the good things that happened, the bad things happened, the confusing things that happened. 2 weeks later, I showed up, started doing the same thing. You could imagine, as someone sort of fresh to building with these things, there were a lot more confusion on my end, right? I had a lot of questions, a lot of things I had never encountered before. So the output of this process is really documents, documentation, feature requests, things like that. They kind of look like this. These are sort of generalized versions of what these documents look like. We build friction logs and we send them to the teams. We share them with these teams to build empathy for what we're doing, to put in requests for things that are coming, or for things that we'd like to see changed, and also to bolster things that are working well. The findings from our friction logging process for this particular endeavor were that we uncovered a few developer pain points that we wanted to address before the next release of the product. We found some bugs in documentation. So in other words, that often looks like a step that is either incorrect or missing. Sometimes it's a step that is relevant to the old version of the product and not the new version of the product, whatever the case may be. We also put in several feature requests for next releases of the product. So we came across things that were, oh, it would be really nice if we had this. We wrote up requests for that. We detailed what that would look like and delivered that to the team as well. The DevRel team, my team, this is kind of the goal and the output of our work as well, was to improve the developer experience. Like I said before, this product is a fairly heavily developer-oriented product, so we wanted to make sure that the developers who are using this in the real world, who don't have my laptop that has access to DM anyone at Slack with a problem when I have one, we want to give them the best experience possible. We wanted to address this snow blindness problem where if you have never seen these things before, the experience of going through it is vastly different from someone who's an expert on it and has done it before. We wanted to make sure that we're sort of building empathy for those folks, that the people who've never touched these things have a different perspective and a super valuable perspective on building our products and using our products as compared to people who are more experienced. But also worth mentioning, the people who are more experienced also have a valid perspective too, right? You want to listen to people at every stage in the process there to get an understanding of what they're doing and what problems they're running into or what things they like. The outcomes of this, we squashed a bunch of documentation bugs, so those are probably the easiest things to address in this process. If things are missing or incorrect or confusing, we can write up a pretty explicit request to, hey, change this line on this page at this URL, and that'll make it feel better. The product roadmap was updated. In other words, we put in feature requests for new things that we wanted to see. We helped the team to prioritize requests for things that were in flight or not yet started that were already in the stack. And we uncovered some blind spots. So importantly, having a couple of different people implement this was really useful there. One thing that's worth mentioning is as we're going through and building these friction logs and actually going and creating our implementation is we approach this as though we have a specific persona. So it's easy when I'm coming fresh to the company to say like, oh, I've never seen Stripe's Bass stuff before. Let's do this as though I've never done it before, right? That's an important persona to have. CJ, my colleague who had also done this, was much more familiar with Stripe, and his perspective in there was also included in his documentation. So it was really useful for me to provide the context to the team that like, hey, this is actually really fresh to me. I've not seen this before, but that's where this feedback is coming from. That's useful to see. You could imagine a lot of people who are encountering our documentation on building with Bass have never seen it before, just as well as some people who are probably sort of Stripe veterans and have built stuff on Stripe's APIs in the past. About the friction log documents themselves, it's important to deliver them in a way that your team sort of understands what they're getting into. So we like to include a size right at the top of our friction log, meaning is this a small or medium or large or extra large or sort of epic size friction log. The reason for that is if it's a small thing like a couple of documentation bugs that we want to change or a question about functionality, that's really easy for someone to sit down with a coffee or 5 minutes between meetings, read a friction log, understand the thing, and either validate it or start a discussion on what might be missing there. If it's a larger friction log, the people receiving them should know that, hey, you should probably set aside an hour, really dedicate some time to this, maybe have a couple people look at it, because it's a much more intense experience when it gets to implementing an entire bank versus sending a link for someone to pay for something online. These friction logs, the output from these documents can actually come from internal and external users. So as I mentioned, my team does advocacy. We're obviously internal to Stripe, but we also work with lots of developers who are sort of third party, right? They're not Stripe employees. They are building things with Stripe. Often we'll collect feedback from them, summarize that in a friction log, put it together in this formalized document, and deliver that to our team. That's a real luxury when you actually have the relationship with the developers to be able to do that. You can also sort of automate some of these things if you have some telemetry in place to see where folks are struggling, to see where problems are coming up, and things like that. Our friction logs call out discomfort and joy. They tend to mention things that are, hey, we really want to see this change. It would be better if we did this. But they also call out things where, oh, I went to this page, and there was functionality right there. I got to that page, I could hit copy, and I got the URL to exactly what I wanted in the language that I wanted, right? It's right there for me. That kind of feedback is really useful for developer teams for sort of the human reason. You want to make sure that the teams who are building your products know that the end users are getting value out of them. And think about that in the context of a friction log. If these documents are really only negative feedback, that can really hurt, right? The actual like emotional side of that is that getting a document that just says like, hey, I wrote up this 12-page diatribe on why this thing doesn't work, it doesn't feel super good, right? Your teams aren't gonna like that. So the positive parts of these things are just as important too, because you want your team to feel good, you also want them to keep building things that provide those moments of joy. The next bullet point, we require emotional intelligence for this. It requires a lot of vulnerability on both sides. That is something that I absolutely cannot understate the value of and the importance of here. If there's one thing to take away from this talk, it's that vulnerability and emotional intelligence between your engineering teams and your end users, between developer advocates and engineering teams, between any sort of two groups of people interacting with your thing, having an expectation for some clear communication and emotionally intelligent communication really sets the stage for being productive. We'll talk about that a little bit more, but it requires everyone to be bought into this. It requires an understanding and a building of a culture that has respect and includes messaging that's in a clear and concise way that's not biting. So criticism and discomfort are tough. If you've ever been in a one-on-one meeting where you've gotten or given negative feedback, you can really feel that sort of visceral feeling of being in a meeting and knowing that something bad is coming. There's a lot of ways you can give and receive negative feedback, and structuring these documents in a way that anything that's sort of requesting change or saying that something isn't working is delivered in a way that is honest and straightforward and not hyperbolic. So think about it this way. There's a huge difference between I wasted 2 hours on this, and I was super frustrated, and I slammed my laptop shut at the end of the day. That's one way to give this feedback. Or you could say, I really struggled to get through this. I didn't understand that in the third step here, it was asking me to, integrate with this API that was listed on this other page. If that link was there, it would have saved me 2 hours. Similar feedback, very different feeling. You can understand that delivering it in one way versus the other is super valuable. And if you stop and think about it for a bit, you've probably encountered places where you see both of those. In particular, if you've lived long enough on the open source web and you've seen a GitHub issue that's got lots of comments on it, you've probably seen people delivering some pretty bad, mean, negative feedback in ways that isn't helpful. And you've probably seen people sort of steering back onto the road there. So I want you all to kind of take this with you and internalize the way you give feedback to people. Internalize that we're all human, that having that human understanding of the person on the other side of the computer is important for your engineering teams, for your end users who you may never have actually met in person. They're actually real people. They have real feelings. They're complex beings, and giving them criticism and receiving criticism from them is something that takes practice. That's kind of a long diatribe. I want to take a pause. I really want to summarize that in a clear, concise way, and I want you to picture this the next time you're giving or receiving feedback. That's it, man. Bill and Ted had it. Be excellent to each other. Think about the person on the other side. Be good to them. Be kind when you receive feedback. Place some understanding and some onus on yourself to be kind in the way that you give and receive words to each other. Going back to how we do this at Stripe. Everyone who becomes an employee at Stripe receives pretty intensive onboarding training for the first month that they're employees at Stripe. During this onboarding, we're all given the expectation that it doesn't matter what your role is at Stripe, it doesn't matter what you're doing, you should feel empowered to deliver feedback on our products. Whether or not it's going through the rigor of delivering an entire friction log like this, or just finding the right team to encounter with, you're encouraged to do that. I believe that that's an important cultural thing for any team, right? You should be able to take your feedback and give it to anyone at your company and feel as though you're being heard. That's something that lands on both sides. You should also have the expectation that you should listen to anyone at your company. It doesn't matter if they're, a college intern or someone who's been at the company for 40 years. Their feedback is valuable and valid. Same thing for your customers. Friction logs are something that are kind of a little difficult to write if you haven't done it before and kind of done this sort of stream of consciousness sitting down and writing. It's an intensive process. Not only are you going and trying something new or retrying something you've encountered before, you're also writing out everything that you do. Sometime when we deliver these friction logs, we actually just do a screencast. We record what's on our screen, we point the webcam at ourselves, and we record that and deliver that as part of the friction log as well. That's what those screenshots you saw before were with my face embedded and my colleague CJ. That's really nice because writing isn't natural for everyone. And you get a lot more of the fidelity of the experience when you're seeing what someone is experiencing in real time. Again, that's one of those things where if you've been frustrated on the keyboard side of a computer before, you've probably said some things you might regret, so you need to be a little careful about what you're doing and how you're doing it when you're recording these things. But delivering these video friction logs is super valuable too. It's valid. Not everyone wants to sit down and write. Not everyone can sit down and write. There's also sort of an accessibility angle there too. Our friction logs at Stripe are shared to everyone at the company. There is a email list that we have when we write a friction log that we send it to everyone at the company with a simple subject line that says, friction log, Mike tried issuing credit cards, or whatever the case may be. Anyone at the company can read it. They're encouraged to. They're encouraged to leave comments on the document, weigh in on it, give their feedback. That's valuable for a bunch of reasons. It's really useful for people who've encountered those problems before, just to say like, oh yeah, I had this problem too. I never thought about it this way, or I've never put it into writing, but I've definitely experienced this. That kind of gives the feedback more weight. It's also useful when someone disagrees with you to have the discussion there in the document in a way that's sort of in context. Disagreements are useful and valuable and valid. And sometimes you can uncover use cases that are folks coming from different perspectives. So you may see someone who's, oh yeah, like I really like that feature because it's working the way I need it to. Maybe that's not the intended behavior, but it is valuable for someone. Okay, maybe we can spin that out into 2 features. Maybe we can leave it as it is or add a set of functionalities that help both people. Or maybe I'm just wrong, right? Maybe I went through this thing and I completely misunderstood something and I missed a step or something that was there. And the thing that I asked for a change in my friction log is wrong, was already there, is something that's already planned, right? Whatever the case may be, it's really useful to get more eyes on these things. These are also the start of the discussion. So they're shared with everyone at the company. They're shared with the specific engineering team building that product. I showed the screenshot of all the products that Stripe makes before. We also, in addition to sending it to that big distribution list, I would send it to the specific product team. And then I'd go open a chat window with them and say, hey team, I just shared this friction log. Here's sort of the document. If you want to link to it there, I'd love to chat with you. Let's keep talking about this. It's not just a document that you write up and sort of toss over a fence and go, run off and do the next thing. It's the start of the discussion. You haven't actually delivered value on the thing until it's been entered into the product building cycle, into that sort of virtuous cycle that I showed before, and the team starts acting on it, right? You want to get your feedback into a prioritized stack rank of things that the engineering teams are building, or maybe rejected, right? They might say, yeah, we understand this, but it's not something we want to do for XYZ reasons. Having that documented is actually really useful too for future discussions. This is the framework for literally what's in the friction log. This is how we put them together. I've covered most of this stuff. The make the journey clear, the second bullet here, is important too. You want to share what you were trying to do when you were doing the thing. So that's something that should be sort of in the executive summary upfront part of this thing. You want to make sure that the people reading your friction log know what your goal was when you were doing this thing. Otherwise, it's kind of just reading a rant from someone or a stream of consciousness that might not make sense. Being illustrative is useful too. So most of our friction logs include images that are marked up with arrows and questions and things like that, call outs to things that we want to see. Sometimes we use short embedded videos, like a 10-second video that you can embed in a document for someone to see. This is literally what I saw when I opened it on my phone. It blew up for a second and then showed me what was happening. That was confusing, or that's something I didn't expect, whatever the case may be. Again, describing issues objectively is useful here. This is coming back to that emotional intelligence thing. You really, really, really want to be objective, but also clear here. You want to say, this did something I didn't expect. This thing broke in a way I wasn't ready for. Or, the thing I wanted to do isn't here. Am I missing something? Very different, again, from delivering it in a way that's hyperbolic and negative. The follow-up step is probably the most important part of this process. So you get your friction log delivered to the team. You should then have ongoing discussions with the team about the things you found. Hey, what did you think about this? Is this something we can get into user experience research? Is this something that makes sense for the team? Have you heard this before? Are there other customers we can talk to? How can we get this into the process of being built? How does this rank against other things that the team is building? And what is the value of building it now versus later? In some cases, if you've been in the engineering process for long enough, you may enter in a feature request that never happens because the stack of things to do in front of it is essentially infinitely long. That's okay, and that has to be an understood part of this process. And that can be particularly frustrating if it's the first time you've ever done one of these friction logs. Hey, I've got this really easy feature request to put in, but the team says they won't get to it for 9 months. Man, okay, that's frustrating, right? We've all encountered that. I see some visceral reactions here. Like, it's a thing, you can kind of feel that, but you need to be ready for that. That's also part of that emotional intelligence and understanding of the realities of building this stuff with other human people that are time constrained and have lots of other things going on. I wanted to call out some of the tools we use for building friction logs because the end result here, the goal is that it doesn't matter how you write it, it matters that the output of the thing is consumable by another person in a way that's useful for both of you. So if you're not the type of person that wants to sit down and write a document, you can open up your Android or iPhone or computer and record a screencast. You can write a Word document, you can do it in Markdown, you could do an illustration if you want on an iPad if that makes more sense for you. It doesn't really matter, there's lots of tools, there's no right way to do that part. The important thing is getting the information into place. This is also a really useful way to put it in front of people who are not hyper-technical, right? You could imagine seeing someone who's an end user, consumer user of something who's not very technically savvy. Getting a screen recording from them is really useful if they're running into a bug. That's very helpful. That may feel like it's a little more on the user experience, user research side of things. But when you've got power users or beta testers or people who are really invested in using your product, getting feedback from them can be just as valuable as getting feedback from someone like me. This is what the documents look like. This is kind of a generalized format of this, and actually in the link that I provided at the beginning and the end, I have a sample template of this if that's something you want to grab. The friction log documents that we deliver to our teams include a high-level summary, they include a title, they include the author, the date, those sorts of things, the size of the friction log. We provide context at the beginning, so that's that persona use case. I'm new to Stripe, I'm trying to do this, or I've been running a business on Stripe for 5 years and I'm adopting a new function, or I need to expand my business into Mexico and I'm trying to figure out what to do there, right? All that context is important. We include pros and cons at the top. So this is on the off chance that someone is reading your document that doesn't have enough time to read the whole thing, which probably happens more often than not. Having a list of here's the good things I saw, here's the bad things I saw right at the top helps people get to where they want to go, or it helps them to up-level the discussion to teams that need to prioritize these things. Later on, these pros and cons can also be links to GitHub issues or Jira issues or GitLab or wherever you do your tracking of projects to say like, this was the finding, this is the work we're doing as a result of it. The discussion is sort of ongoing there. We also include detailed notes. So this is, again, the stream of consciousness. This is literally, here's what I'm doing, here's what I'm thinking, this is what I typed, this is what happened, for the duration of what you're doing. For a very small friction log, you can imagine that's not super difficult. For something like building a bank from scratch, that would probably take a while. That's where these documents get really long. But this is also where the empathy is built for the person who is the end user of the friction log, the person who's going through this process. You're seeing everything they're doing to try to get something done. And sometimes it can be really helpful to see like, oh man, this person had to take 50 steps to do this implementation because they went down this documentation path, but if they went to this other page, it simplifies it massively. And having that understanding of how they got there is not always obvious to the engineering teams building it, or the technical writers putting together documentation, or designers designing marketing sites and things like that. Using automation to close the loop on your feedback and your friction logs is tantamount to a superpower. This is something that if you're able to with the product you're building and sort of the telemetry you have in place, it's really nice to be able to go and take feedback from an end user, to log it in a friction log, to create an issue or create documentation of whatever sort your team uses, to request a change, to make that change, get a notification that the change was then deployed and go back to the customer. Feels like magic. So think of it this way. I open up a chat on your site using, it doesn't have to be intercom. It could be intercom or drift or whatever embedded chat thing you have on your site, saying, hey, I really wanted to issue a credit card for my friend living in Belgium. He's a colleague, we've been working together. This is what I tried to do, didn't work. Opening that discussion with the team should then go and create some sort of documentation on the issuing side of things that is, oh, this person had a problem, they had a specific request. We may fix it, we may not fix it, but we know they had that discussion. That's useful for support cases in the future, so if they open up another chat, you can say, hey, by the way, I know you had this request in the past, we haven't completed it yet, or we are working on it, or whatever the case may be. But having that sort of human relationship with an end user using your thing creates a tacit feeling of connection, of attachment, of loyalty to your brand, of feeling like there's actually a person there. Once your team starts to address these things, the other side of it is you can then validate what you're doing with that end user. So, hey, you said you had this problem with cards in Belgium. Like, we heard that. We think actually what was happening is that you were using the wrong routing number for this, or the information you're putting into this. We required one more bit of information, but it looks like your API call was missing that. Having that discussion sort of can close the loop even faster. And then even better when you're actually able to go and deliver something like, hey, they had this really cool feature request. They wanted to add coupon codes to this automated checkout thing we have, and that's not on this page if you're on a phone. Why don't we up-level that to the UI on the phone? If you're able to actually deliver that and then say, Monday morning, hey, we fixed your problem. Do you want to go try this out? We think we fixed this for you. Like, please go test this thing out. If you've ever been on the receiving side of that, that feels great. That's amazing. That's creating a product that is solving someone's problem proactively and then also connecting it back to them so that they feel the personal service of what you're doing. If you think about the impact of that, the loyalty that would build, that's incredible. That's something that is hard to do and requires a cultural shift in many cases. It requires a level of vulnerability and discomfort and transparency with your end users that can be a little difficult to get through. But if you're able to get there on any level, it's really a valuable thing to do. So in the end, if all goes well and you're able to collect feedback from internal users or from external users, and document it in a friction log, write up what you found, put in requests for the team, maybe make a video, maybe make a document, send that across, and you get feedback from the team, you build something out and you deliver on it, you might start to see things like this. This is something that is maybe what I'm proudest about working at Stripe. All the time, we see users coming back to us on Twitter saying, hey, I'm surprised and delighted by this thing that happened, right? You were proactive about this. You built this feature I was asking for. I've waited for this forever. And it's coming back to us, and they are calling it out into the world. And that's a really nice feeling. It doesn't always happen, but when it does, it's pretty amazing. And I'm the first to admit that as someone who's built a product with Stripe in the past, it's something that I've put in lots of requests for, and sometimes they go through, sometimes they don't. But when you see these sorts of things, it's a sign that things are going well. It may not come on Twitter, depending on sort of where your business is and the culture that you've built with your customers. It may come with direct one-on-one relationships with your sales teams, or even just with your engineering teams and your end users directly, whatever the relationship may be. But you'll get some sense of that feeling when feedback is being delivered and taken and understood. In the end, this is kind of the thing I want you to feel. I want you to feel like when you get feedback from someone, there's a plan. There's a cultural understanding that feedback is good, that iterating on what you have already is something that's hyper important to making a product that people attach to, that people trust, that people want to use and provides value. I also want you to feel like you have a plan for communicating with other people that you work with, whether or not it is you communicating with a customer or a customer communicating with your engineering team or salespeople communicating with your engineering team or whatever the relationship may be. That cultural understanding of clear and concise and emotionally intelligent communication is a muscle that takes a ton of practice to get right. It's something that requires repetitions and won't always go great, but having the shared understanding that everyone is driving towards the same goal of making this product better so that people's lives are better in some way is super important. I want you to feel like you have a plan for that. I want you to feel like you understand each other and that there's a real person behind the keyboard. So I'll kind of leave it there. I'm happy to take some questions. I'll be around all day. We have a Stripe lounge around the corner if you want to come and grab some time with us to talk about something. You can find me on Twitter. My email address is there. The slides are at that link. There's also a couple of articles I've linked there and a template friction logging toolkit that you can use for your teams. What I'm really interested in hearing from you is the way this works at your company, things that you've done, ways that you've connected with customers in the past or closed the feedback loop or found ways to engage with the people that you work with that have worked really well or maybe that haven't worked well. Learning from what's not working well is just as important as what is. Included some recommended reading here. It's probably better if you download the slides because there are URLs behind these things. Frictionlog.com is kind of the canonical resource for friction logging. It's not a site that I'm associated with, but it's a really great resource. They've got lots of stuff on how to create friction logs, how to create that culture behind it. This article, An Introduction to Friction Logging, is a wonderful primer on it. If you have to send one link to someone to get started, that's a good way to do it. We just published a blog post on our Stripe developer advocate blog on dev.to yesterday on how we use friction logs at Stripe. It's a lot like this talk. It goes into a ton more detail on the specifics of the little sections of the documents and how we think about collecting and giving feedback. Would love to hear your feedback on that as well. You can chase me down for anything that you want to add onto this. And once again, the bit.ly link is there for the friction logging toolkit too. So that's all. I'm around if you have any questions. Thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And be excellent to each other. Thanks, everyone.